My name is Daniel. Mrs. Ramirez is my teacher. She's nice, but something is weird. It smells funny under her desk, like old milk and crayons. It's kinda gross. One day I dropped my pencil. It rolled under Mrs. Ramirez's desk. I crawled to get it. That's when I heard it. A tiny giggle. Right under the desk, I told my friend Emily. Maybe it's a ghost, she whispered. I didn't think so. Ghosts don't giggle. The mystery under Mrs. Ramirez's desk was driving me crazy. The smell got worse. It started as a faint whiff, something you could almost ignore, but then it grew stronger, more pungent, filling the entire classroom. It was like a wave of stench that you couldn't escape from. Now it smelled like dirty diapers too. Kids started noticing. They whispered and pointed. The whispers turned into giggles and the giggles into full-blown laughter. Everyone was trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. Mrs. Ramirez just pretended not to hear. She was focused on the lesson, trying to maintain order, but it was clear she was aware of the disruption. Her eyes darted around the room, but she never acknowledged the smell. One day, I saw a juice box roll out from under the desk. It was empty. It rolled slowly, almost as if it was trying to escape the chaos. I wondered how long it had been there, hidden away, contributing to the mysterious odor. I looked at Mrs. Ramirez. She was still reading, her eyes glued to the book, but there was something different about her today. She was reading, but her face was red. It was as if she was embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. I wondered if she knew more about the smell than she was letting on. After school, I waited for Emily. The classroom was empty now, and the smell had dissipated, but the mystery remained. I knew we had to get to the bottom of it. We have to find out what's under there, I said. Emily was scared. Her eyes were wide, and she kept glancing around as if expecting something to jump out at us.
What if it's a monster? She asked. Her voice was trembling, and I could tell she was genuinely frightened.
I shook my head. Monsters weren't real, I told myself. But the fear in Emily's eyes made me second guess. It's too small to be a monster. I tried to sound confident, but even I wasn't sure. The smell was too strange, too persistent. I think it's a kid. Maybe someone was hiding, or maybe it was something else entirely, but one thing was clear. We had to find out. The next day I brought cookies. I dropped one on purpose near Mrs. Ramirez's desk. I waited. A tiny hand reached out and grabbed it, then it disappeared under the desk. I saw crayons under there too, and a stuffed bear. My heart started to beat fast. Why was there a kid under there? I told Emily what I saw. She gasped.
We have to tell someone, she said.
I knew she was right, but who would believe us? It was Friday. Mrs. Ramirez was reading a story. Suddenly a little boy peeked out from under the desk. He had messy brown hair and big brown eyes. He looked scared. Everyone gasped. Mrs. Ramirez froze. Her face turned white.
David, go back under the desk, she whispered.
But it was too late. The whole class had seen him. Some kids laughed, others looked confused. I felt sorry for Mrs. Ramirez. And for the little boy. He was small, maybe 3 years old. What was he doing under there? Mr. Johnson took Mrs. Ramirez and David to his office. We could hear them talking, but we couldn't make out the words. The whole class was buzzing with whispers.
Some kids thought Mrs. Ramirez was silly.
Others felt sorry for her.
I felt bad for David. He didn't understand what was happening. After what seemed like forever, Mr. Johnson came back. He looked serious.
Class, Mrs. Ramirez had to leave. She'll be back tomorrow.
He wouldn't tell us anything else, but we all knew something was wrong. The next day, Mrs. Ramirez wasn't there. Another teacher, Mrs. Thompson, told us about Mrs. Ramirez.
Mrs. Ramirez is a single mom. She couldn't afford a babysitter for David, and she couldn't afford to miss work.
Mrs. Thompson looked at us.
It's hard being a single parent. Sometimes life throws you curveballs.
We all understood. We felt bad for judging Mrs. Ramirez. Mrs. Ramirez came back a week later. She looked tired. Her eyes had dark circles and her shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. The classroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing the change.
I won't be your teacher anymore. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the silent room. The students exchanged glances, confusion and sadness mingling in their eyes. I got a job as a waitress, she explained, trying to muster a smile. It was a different kind of work, one that required her to be on her feet for long hours, serving strangers instead of teaching young minds. It pays more, and I can work at night when David is sleeping. She continued, her voice tinged with a mix of resignation and hope. The night shifts meant she could be there for her son during the day, a small comfort in the midst of change.
As she packed her things, some kids went up to her and said goodbye. They were hesitant at first, unsure of how to express their feelings. But soon, the room was filled with murmurs of farewell. They gave her drawings and cards. Each one was a small token of their appreciation, a way to say thank you for the lessons and the care she had given them. I made her a card too. It was a simple drawing, but it came from the heart. I wanted her to know that she had made a difference. I drew a picture of her, David, in our class. It was my way of capturing a moment in time, a memory that I hoped she would cherish.
"We'll miss you, Mrs. Ramirez." The words were spoken with sincerity, a collective voice of the class expressing their heartfelt emotions.
Thank you for everything. The gratitude was palpable, a testament to the impact she had made on their young lives.
Good luck, Mrs. Ramirez. The final words of farewell were filled with hope and well wishes, a bittersweet end to a chapter.
We never saw David again. The classroom felt emptier without him, a void that was hard to ignore. But sometimes I thought I could still smell crayons and old milk in the air. It was a lingering reminder of the past, a scent that brought back memories of simpler times, of laughter and learning, of a teacher who had touched our lives in ways we would never forget. Mrs. Ramirez's desk stayed empty for a long time. It was a stark reminder of her absence, a void that couldn't be filled easily. The desk, once bustling with papers, books, and her personal touches, now stood as a silent testament to her impact on our lives. It was strange not having her there. The classroom felt incomplete, like a puzzle with a missing piece. Her absence was felt deeply by everyone, from the students to the staff. We all wondered where she was and what had happened to her. We missed her stories and her kind smile. Mrs. Ramirez had a way of making every lesson feel like an adventure. Her stories were not just educational, but also filled with warmth and wisdom. Her smile could light up the room, making even the toughest days seem manageable.
We learned a lot from Mrs. Ramirez. She taught us more than just the curriculum. She taught us life lessons. Her teachings went beyond textbooks and exams. She showed us how to be curious, how to ask questions, and how to seek knowledge in everything we do. We learned that life can be tough. There were days when the workload seemed overwhelming and the challenges insurmountable. But Mrs. Ramirez always encouraged us to push through, to find strength in adversity, and to never give up. We learned that sometimes good people make bad choices when they're desperate. Mrs. Ramirez's sudden absence taught us about the complexities of life. It made us realize that everyone has their own battles, and sometimes those battles lead to difficult decisions. And we learned that it's important to be kind even when we don't understand what's going on. Kindness became our way of coping, our way of supporting each other through the uncertainty. We learned to be there for one another, to offer a helping hand, and to show compassion.
The empty desk was a reminder of Mrs. Ramirez and her struggles. It stood as a symbol of the challenges she faced, challenges that we might never fully understand, but it also reminded us of her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering dedication to her students. It was also a reminder that everyone has a story. Each of us carries our own experiences, our own struggles, and our own triumphs. Mrs. Ramirez's story was just one of many, a story that intertwined with ours in ways we couldn't have imagined. And sometimes those stories are hidden under the surface, just like David was hidden under the desk. Just as David found a place to hide, we all have parts of our stories that we keep hidden. But in sharing and understanding these stories, we find connection and empathy. Eventually, we got a new teacher, Mr. Davis. He was funny and made us laugh a lot. He was a good teacher, but it wasn't the same.
We still talked about Mrs. Ramirez sometimes. We wondered how she was doing, how David was doing.
Do you think she's okay?
Mr. Davis told us that Mrs. Ramirez was brave for doing what she thought was best for her son.
Everyone makes mistakes, but it's important to learn from them.
I learned a lot that year in 3rd grade. I learned about fractions and presidents, but I also learned about life, about empathy, and about understanding. I learned that life isn't always fair. I learned that sometimes people have to make tough choices. And I learned that it's important to show compassion even when we don't agree with someone's actions. The secret under Mrs. Ramirez's desk wasn't a monster or a ghost. It was a problem, a human problem. And sometimes human problems are the scariest of all.